Hi, this is Jamie Franklin, curator here at the Bennington Museum. Welcome to another tour at 10. Today I'm coming to you from our Robert Frost exhibition again. Robert Frost at present in Vermont. And as you may have learned from some of the previous tours at 10 that I've given here in this gallery, in this exhibit, the Robert Frost exhibit explores Robert Frost's time here in southern Vermont when he lived in South Shaftesbury from 1920 to 1938. But one of the major threads that runs throughout the exhibition, no pun intended, standing here in front of this quilt, is the role that Frost's relationships with other artists and writers living and working in southern Vermont during the same period played. A lot of times, particularly with figures, prominent cultural figures, particularly ones as famous as Robert Frost, perhaps America's most beloved poet, we tend to put them on a pedestal, and we don't think about them in terms of their relationships and connections to other artists and the roles that those relationships might have played in their own work. And so this quilt, which I'm standing in front of, is really one of my favorite objects from our collection in this exhibition. And it really helps me, as an art historian and as a historian, help talk about the relationships and the roles that relationships and networks of people play in artists and writers' work. So this is what's known as a signature quilt. Signature quilts were extremely popular in the mid-19th century. This one was probably created around 1910, and it was owned by Lady Beatrice Gosford. Lady Beatrice Gosford owned an 18th century tavern known variously as the Madison Tavern or the Topping Tavern, which is out on East Road in Shaftesbury. And in fact, she gave the tavern and its contents to the museum. It was operated as a living history museum up until the 1990s. So many of you maybe have been familiar with it through that. But while she owned and lived in the tavern during the 1930s and 40s, she invited over many of the most prominent cultural figures, writers and artists living and working in southern Vermont during that period. And so this signature quilt includes the signatures of many of the artists and writers who were friends and neighbors of Robert Frost during his time. So we have Robert Frost's signature right here, Robert Frost, South Shaftesbury, Vermont. But we have many of the other artists and writers who are also showcased in this exhibition. So here we have Sarah Cleghorn, who is another artist. This is signed July 31st, 1937. She lived up in Manchester, Vermont. Harriet Miller, a sculptor and patron who we have talked about in previous episodes of Tours at 10. Margaret Hard, her husband Walter Hard, both writers, also have their signatures on this quilt. Dorothy Canfield Fisher, Carl Ruggles, the composer. I'll also point out John Spargo, who is the founding director of the Bennington Museum and a major kind of political and cultural figure. Sinclair Lewis, another of the prominent writers, a best-selling author, who lived here in southern Vermont with his wife, Dorothy Thompson, whose signature is also somewhere on here. They moved to Vermont in 1928 and lived here through the 1940s. And we have a number of things related to Sinclair Lewis and his connection to Frost on this exhibit. But really it's this kind of physical manifestation of the ways that these artists and writers were living and working and related to one another, and that's what this whole exhibition is about. So it's really one of my favorite objects. Another one of the artists whose name is up here, it might be hard for you to get up close because it's way up there in the upper left-hand corner, is Luigi Luccione. Who is sometimes kind of unofficially called the painter laureate of Vermont. And if you just take a turn with me, this is a beautiful painting by Luigi Luccione that's in the Frost exhibit. We don't have any direct evidence that Frost and Luccione knew each other or were close. Luccione summered here in Vermont starting in the 1930s. And this is a painting that I included in this show because it shows the sort of kind of thematic interest that Frost shared with a number of the artists that lived and worked here during this period, including Luccione, which is the beautiful paper birch trees that are scattered throughout the landscape here in southern Vermont. You know, this is one of Luccione's earliest paintings of birches, which became a kind of iconic subject matter. Of course, Frost also wrote a lot about birches, and he had a birch grove that he referred to as his lady trees on his farm called the Gully in South Shaftesbury. And so just a really exquisite painting by Luccione that shows those sort of thematic interests that he shared with many of the artists and writers that were living and working with him. And the quilt, which helps demonstrate those relationships, even when they may not have been personal friends, but shows how a lot of these artists and writers were thinking about the same things, whether they were connected to each other personally or not. So thanks for joining me again for another Tour at 10, and I'll see you again soon.